This is the Heroes for Freedom podcast. I'm Rick Robinson. Sophie Scholl. An end to terror, she said, is preferable to a terror without end. Barely out of her teens, Sophie Scholl stood with her jailer, facing the steel and wood contraption of death that was called the guillotine. This was a French word, obviously, but pronounced about the same in German. Sophie felt the rough hand of the jailer on her back, shoving her into the room. She stumbled, gasping, nearly toppling forward onto this horrible machine. She wore a simple black dress that she had had in the prison, her neck bare, as were her arms. In fact, they'd cropped her hair short so as not to interfere with the severing power of the machine's heavy blade. "Not to worry, Fräulein. It will be over in a moment." Normally, she would have reacted to such an insane statement by the guard. But she could not take her eyes off the simple mechanism, standing like an evil sentinel before her in the middle of the windowless room. This true story of one of history's great heroes is found in my Heroes for Freedom manual series. You can see copies over my shoulder. And they're in full color with hundreds of original color images and historical photos. The links in the show notes, you can find them below, and I hope you'll check them out. You know, I so appreciate it if you could take a minute and provide a review or leave a comment. I read every one. I want you to know that. Thank you. Sophie Magdalena Scholl had always been a dedicated Christian. But like other German girls, she'd first joined the Nazi League of German Maidens. But soon, she became disillusioned with the movement, of course. Its goals were grossly anti-Christian. In fact, the moral standards were terrible, by her Christian standards, of course. For this National Socialism that was being promoted by these killers was corrupting Germany's soul in her mind. They were destroying, in fact, the people's lives, and they were causing a lot of pain and suffering. In fact, this was changing everything in the name of the so-called master race. It was punishing anyone, of course, who opposed their satanic objectives. Sophie and her family and friends were troubled. They struggled, really, mightily, to know what to do. She almost did not, in fact, graduate from high school because she was angry that the public school system had become merely an indoctrination program for the government. And Christian churches were either joining with Hitler and joining the cause, or they were being shut down. In fact, hundreds of priests and pastors who disagreed with what the government was doing were arrested and were murdered. So increasingly, Sophie and her brother Hans began to meet with friends and fellow students, and they spoke against the party that had taken over the country, particularly at the University of Munich, where they attended. But they had to be careful about this. Of course, this was war, and the nation was at war. They understood that they were fighting against, however, a system that was not only corrupt and brutal, but more so intensely evil. They leaned on their Christian faith admirably, which impelled them that they needed to take a stand. Sophie determined to resist, passively, of course, not violently, by spreading the truth about the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And of course, the acronym for that official title was shortened by the party to Nazi. She and her brother, Hans, and others created White Rose. This was a nonviolent resistance movement, basically, at the University of Munich. Sophie wrote that murderers had taken over their nation and must be overthrown. So the White Rose group began printing pamphlets, and they distributed them. They successfully produced and handed out 5 separate issues of their increasingly popular tract. Some they'd mailed, of course, and some they left in a variety of public places and at the university, outside of classrooms and gathering areas. Sophie wrote in one of the pamphlets, quote, "Every individual conscious of his responsibility as a member of Christian or Western civilization must defend himself as best he can at this late hour. He must work against fascism and any similar system of totalitarianism," unquote. One of her pamphlets said, quote, "Every word that comes from Hitler's mouth is a lie. When he says peace, he means war. And when he blasphemously uses the name of the Almighty, he really means the power of evil, the fallen angel, Satan," unquote. While at a university building, and they were quietly distributing, as they often did, these pamphlets before the classes got out. This was actually the sixth issue of their pamphlet, and it was on February 18th, 1943. Unfortunately, a janitor, a member of the party, with the Nazi party at the university, spotted them, and I think they must have been looking for them, and had them arrested immediately. While being interrogated at police headquarters, Sophie told the police, quote, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we do," unquote. Sophie, her brother Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst were brought before the notorious People's Court, and they had obviously been beaten and abused beforehand. You could see it. And though very young, the brutal Nazi judge, Roland Freisler, made certain that they were condemned to death, to make an example of them. Judge Freisler, during his time on the People's Court, condemned to death over it's interesting, really, 5,000 people, most of them political prisoners. He had a conviction rate, in fact, over 90%. On February the 22nd, 1943, at 5 p.m. at Munich's Stadelheim prison, Sophie and Hans Scholl, along with their friend Christoph Probst, were taken one by one to the execution room and murdered by guillotine. As mentioned, the sadistic government judge, Roland Freisler, who had sentenced them to death, in fact, first really wanted to hang them in public, in the public square, and was determined he was going to do that. But others on the court convinced him that there might be repercussions if a public execution of these young German university students took place. So instead, he reluctantly decided to have them killed in secret by guillotine out of the public eye, so nobody knew that it had taken place and it was not announced. Incidentally, later, that sixth and final edition of Sophie's pamphlet, the one that they had been distributing at the university when they were captured, was smuggled out of Germany shortly after her death, and it ended up in Allied hands. The Americans reproduced it, and in honor of Sophie, they dropped several million copies by bomber over Germany that summer of 1943. They told the German people in the pamphlet what their government had done to these innocent Christian young people who courageously stood for truth and had opposed evil. Today, you can visit Sophie Magdalena Scholl's grave. It's a humble affair, and it's resting quietly, without much notice, in an historic cemetery amid trees and carefully trimmed grapevines. It's located just south of the city of Munich, Germany. Next to her are buried her brother Hans and their friend Christoph, both executed with Sophie by the Nazis for high treason. Her final words, just prior to her execution by guillotine, were, "Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. What does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Unquote. In hindsight, to me, I think what's tragic, so very tragic, is how few people were willing to stand up for Sophie, who was doing everything she could to warn people and to stop the madness. Sophie and her brother Hans and his friend Christoph found essentially no takers willing to challenge the horror that was Nazism of the 1930s and 40s. These courageous young Germans, sadly, they had to stand alone. But time, has a way of offering perspective. In the early 2000s, a German women's magazine, name of it Brigitte, I believe, named Sophie the greatest woman of the 20th century. Well, she was certainly one of the bravest. Sophie was never a girl who minced words. She always spoke her mind, even to the end. She wrote some of her letters out of her cell before she was killed. Quote, "The real damage is done by those millions who want to survive. The honest men who just want to be left in peace. Those with no sides and no causes. Those who don't like to make waves or enemies. Those for whom freedom, honor, truth, and principles are only literature. If you do not make any noise, the bad guys won't find you. True, but it's all an illusion because they die too. Those people who roll up their spirits into tiny little balls to be safe." Oh, safe from what? "Life is always on the edge of death," she said. "A little candle burns itself out, just like a flaming torch does. I choose my own way to burn," unquote. Sophie had a powerful faith in Jesus Christ, and that carried her, I think, through to her death. She wrote, "I will cling to the rope God has thrown to me in Jesus Christ, even when my numb hands can no longer feel. But isn't it a riddle and awe-inspiring that everything is so beautiful despite the horror? Only man can be truly ugly because he has the free will to estrange himself from this song of godly praise. Amazing truths from this young woman. Sophie's final words, as recorded by her prison supervisor, Walter Romer, was this: "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Unquote. Nazism and its accompanying secular progressivism that's based upon supposed science had made Germany a hollow, faithless, hellish entity where people trembled alone in their homes and hiding places, fearing neighbors, fearing even their family members, all who could possibly report them to the authorities. All of it, I think, in truth, was satanic. I mean, you can see it. It's eugenics embracing a hellish madhouse, cooked up in the twisted mind of one man, Adolf Hitler, and then executed by his many minions. These were godless totalitarians, and they literally gutted Germany, particularly the people's openness towards the Christian faith. I think it was one of the greatest casualties of the war, but few people talk about it. What Germany experienced is a contagious mind virus, a political ideology, an anti-Christ, anti-Christian death cult. Quietly and subversively, it is spreading today like cancer into all lands and nations, though in a somewhat different, westernized form that we see it around us today. The Christian faith is an increasingly precious, even rare force for good in our world, one that is becoming harder and harder to find. And by design, I believe, we see it all around us being canceled or more often co-opted for political purposes, both in the public sphere, but more so, I think, in our once righteous institutions, even corporations. Worse, in the hearts and minds of our young people. Even within our churches, the toxic mind virus, secular progressivism, it's spreading. Though very young, Sophie was brilliant. She spotted this evil almost immediately. She identified it. And in spite of her lack of public support, she remained a rare gem of integrity and courage, and in the end, left prison officials marveling. She said in her letters, quote, "Stand up for what you believe, even if you must stand alone," unquote. One of my greatest heroes will always be Sophie Scholl. She stood against the evil the only way she knew how. Her courage to the end testifies to us all how one person can make a difference in the name of Christ to help rescue the soul of a nation and to help the survival of our world. My prayer is that the young people of America will take her tragic yet heroic story to heart and remember it. For the time will come when such courage will once more be required of you, of all of us. And I know that the spirit of Sophie Scholl will rise again, filling the hearts and souls of America's blessed youth, who have been saved by God, I believe, to be born at this pivotal time in history. The Spirit bears witness to me that the young people of today have within them the power to shake the very foundations of hell as we prepare for Christ's glorious second coming. I appreciate your time. I'm Rick Robison, and this is the Heroes for Freedom podcast.